Now we're going to look at what the AIM has to say, your Aeronautical Information Manual, with regards to Class Charlie airspace. So if we look in section 3-2-4, you'll see Class Charlie airspace. The definition: generally that airspace from the surface to 4,000 feet above the airport elevation, charted in MSL, mean sea level, surrounding those airports that have an operational control tower, are serviced by a radar approach control, and that have a certain number of IFR operations or passenger enplanements. Although the configuration of each Class C airspace area is individually tailored, the airspace usually consists of a 5 nautical mile radius core surface area that extends from the surface up to 4,000 feet above the airport elevation, and a 10 nautical mile radius shelf area that extends no lower than 1,200 feet up to 4,000 feet above the airport elevation. Your charts: Class C airspace is charted on sectional charts, IFR en route, low altitude, and terminal area charts where appropriate. Operating rules and pilot equipment requirements. Pilot certifications: there are none. No specific certification required. Equipment: you need two-way radio communication and, unless otherwise authorized by ATC, an operable radar beacon transponder with automatic altitude reporting capability and operable ADS-B out equipment. Note: see paragraph 4-1-20, transponder and ADS-B out operation, subparagraph F for Mode C transponder ADS-B requirements for operating above Class Charlie airspace. Arrival or through flight entry requirements. Two-way radio communication must be established with the ATC facility, providing ATC services prior to entry, and thereafter maintain those communications while in Class Charlie airspace. Pilots of arriving aircraft should contact the Class Charlie airspace ATC facility on the publicized frequency and give their position, altitude, radar beacon code, destination, and request Class Charlie service. Radio contact should be initiated far enough from the Class Charlie airspace boundary to preclude entering Class Charlie airspace before two-way radio communications are established. Note: 1. If the controller responds to a radio call with aircraft call sign standby, radio communications have been established and the pilot can enter the Class Charlie airspace. 2. If workload or traffic conditions prevent intermediate provision of Class Charlie services, the controller will inform the pilot to remain outside of Class Charlie airspace until conditions permit the services to be provided. 3. It is important to understand that if the controller responds to the initial radio call without using the aircraft identification, radio communications have not been established and the pilot may not enter the Class Charlie airspace. 4. Class Charlie airspace areas have a procedural outer area. Normally that area is 20 nautical miles from the primary Class Charlie airspace airport. Its vertical limit extends from the lower limits of radar coverage up to the ceiling of the approach control's delegated airspace, excluding the Class Charlie airspace itself and other airspace as appropriate. This outer area is not charted. 5. Pilots approaching an airport with Class Charlie services should be aware that if they descend below the base altitude of the 5 to 10 mile shelf during an instrument or visual approach, they may encounter non-transponder, non-ADS-B VFR aircraft. Example: 1. Aircraft call sign, remain outside of the Class Charlie airspace and stand by. 2. Aircraft calling Dulles approach control, stand by. 4. Departures from: A. A primary or satellite airport with an operating control tower. Two-way radio communications must be established and maintained with the control tower and thereafter as instructed by ATC while operating in Class Charlie airspace. B. A satellite airport without an operating control tower, two-way radio communications must be established as soon as practicable after departing with the ATC facility having jurisdiction over the Class Charlie airspace. 5. Aircraft speed. Unless otherwise authorized or required by ATC, no person may operate an aircraft at or below 2,500 feet above the surface within 4 nautical miles of the primary airport of a Class Charlie airspace at an indicated airspeed of more than 200 knots or 230 miles per hour. So you can still be in Class Charlie airspace once you are outside of that 4 nautical mile radius or above 2,500 feet AGL and be able to speed up to, but not exceeding, 250 knots. But as long as you are inside of that 4 nautical mile ring below 2,500 feet, make sure you are maintaining 200 knots maximum. Now, you're not going to be doing this on arrival. This will be on departure, obviously, because nobody wants to be coming into an airport that fast. But on your departures, just make sure you don't exceed 200 knots until, once again, you're outside of that 4 nautical mile radius and below 2,500 feet. Continuing on, D, air traffic services. When two-way radio communications and radar contact are established, all VFR aircraft are 1. Sequenced to the primary airport, 2. Provided Class Charlie services within the Class Charlie airspace and the outer area, 3. Provided basic radar services beyond the outer area on a workload permitting basis. This can be terminated by the controller if workload dictates. E. Aircraft separation. Separation is provided within the Class Charlie airspace and the outer area after two-way radio communications and radar contact are established. VFR aircraft are separated from IFR aircraft within the Class Charlie airspace by any of the following. 1. Visual separation. 2. 500 feet vertical separation. 3. Target resolution. 4. Wake turbulence separation will be provided to all aircraft operating A. Behind and less than 1,000 feet below super or heavy aircraft. B. To small aircraft operating behind and less than 500 feet below a Boeing 757 aircraft. And C. To small aircraft following a large aircraft on final approach. Note: separation and sequencing of VFR aircraft will be suspended in the event of a radar outage, as this service is dependent on radar. The pilot will be advised that the service is not available and issued wind, runway information, and the time or place to contact the tower. 2. Separation of VFR aircraft will be suspended during SENRAT operations. Traffic advisories and sequencing to the primary airport will be provided on a workload permitting basis. The pilot will be advised when SENRAT is in use. Pilot participation is voluntary within the outer area and can be discontinued within the outer area at the pilot's request. Class Charlie services will be provided in the outer area unless the pilot requests termination of the service. 4. Some facilities provide Class Charlie services only during published hours. At other times, terminal IFR radar services will be provided. It is important to note that the communications and transponder ADS-B requirements are dependent on the class of airspace established outside of the published hours. Secondary airports. In some locations, Class Charlie airspace may overlie the Class D surface area on a secondary airport. In order to allow that control tower to provide service to aircraft, portions of the overlapping Class Charlie airspace may be procedurally excluded when the secondary airport tower is in operation. Aircraft operating in these procedurally excluded areas will only be provided airport traffic control services when in communication with the secondary airport tower. 2. Aircraft proceeding inbound to a satellite airport will be terminated at a sufficient distance to allow time to change to the appropriate tower or advisory frequency. Class Charlie services to these aircraft will be discontinued when the aircraft is instructed to contact the tower or change to advisory frequency. Number 3. Aircraft departing secondary controlled airports will not receive Class Charlie services until they have been radar identified and two-way communications have been established with the Class Charlie airspace facility. 4. This program is not to be interpreted as relieving pilots of their responsibilities to see and avoid other traffic operating in basic VFR weather conditions, to adjust their operations and flight path as necessary to preclude serious wake encounters, to maintain appropriate terrain and obstruction clearance, or to remain in weather conditions equal to or better than the minimums required by 14 CFR Section 91-155. Approach control should be advised and a revised clearance or instruction obtained when compliance with an assigned route, heading, or an altitude is likely to compromise pilot responsibility with respect to terrain and obstruction clearance, vortex exposure, and weather minimums.